The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the front door while Ethan Walker was out back pulling weeds from the fence line. It sat on the worn hardwood floor for nearly 2 hours before he noticed it, a crisp white envelope with the Silver Creek Estates HOA logo embossed in silver ink on the upper left corner, the kind of stationery that announced its own importance before you even broke the seal. When he finally picked it up and read it, standing in his kitchen with mud still caked on his boots, he laughed. Not a short, dismissive laugh, but a long, genuine one that echoed off the bare walls of the old farmhouse. Because the letter was addressed to current occupant, and it demanded $8,240 in unpaid membership dues, administrative fees, and what it called community compliance penalties, and it gave him exactly 14 days to pay in full or face formal eviction proceedings. The punchline, the part that made him set the letter down and actually wipe tears from the corners of his eyes, was that Ethan Walker's farm had never, not for a single day in its entire recorded history, belonged to any homeowners association. Not when the parcel first broke off from the original township survey in 1894. Not when it passed from family to family, across 3 generations of Cedar Ridge history, each transfer recorded with the county in clean, unambiguous language that said nothing about covenants or associations or community standards. Not when Ethan bought it 4 months ago and signed his name to a deed that was as unencumbered as any piece of earth in the county. The title company had been thorough. The search had been thorough. Ethan himself, with his professional instincts, had read every page of every document attached to the closing package, and there was nothing in any of them that placed his 63 acres inside the jurisdiction of Silver Creek Estates or anyone else. What Victoria Langford, president of Silver Creek Estates HOA, did not know when she authorized that letter was that the man she had just threatened had spent 22 years working as a land records specialist for a title insurance company in Denver, reviewing complex chains of title, untangling boundary disputes, and reading between the lines of documents that were designed, sometimes deliberately, to obscure what they meant. He had read more property records, plat maps, deed restrictions, and chain of title reports than most attorneys see in a lifetime, and he had developed, over those 22 years, a very particular and well-practiced instinct for when something that looked like authority was actually something else entirely. And now, standing in the kitchen of the farm he had worked so hard to find and fought so hard to buy, he set the letter down on the counter next to his coffee mug, looked out at the pasture where Hatch was running the fence line in the morning light, and began to think very carefully about what he was going to do next. Ethan had not always been the kind of man who wanted a farm. For most of his adult life, he had been the kind of man who wanted efficiency, proximity, clean lines, and easy commutes, the kind of man who bought a 3-bedroom colonial in a suburb of Denver and told himself that the neighborhood association fees were just part of the deal. He and his wife, Carrie, had lived there for 11 years, long enough to watch the maple in the backyard grow from a sapling into something that actually gave shade, long enough to paint the guest room twice and tear out the original tile in the master bath, and argue about whether the kitchen needed granite or quartz. The marriage ended quietly, the way most long marriages do when they end, not with a single detonation, but with a slow, exhausted unraveling, and when the house sold in the spring of the year he turned 44, Ethan took his half and held it for nearly 6 months before he decided what he wanted. What he decided was that he was done with suburbs, done with fences set 18 inches apart from a neighbor's fence, done with scheduled trash days and parking ordinances, and the low persistent anxiety of living inside a system designed by committee. He wanted land. He wanted mornings without noise. He wanted, more than anything, to feel like his property was actually his. The listing for the Cedar Ridge parcel came through an agricultural real estate agent named Gerald Hoffman, who sent it over with a brief note that said simply, "I think this might be what you've been describing." It was 63 acres in the high plains east of a small Colorado town called Cedar Ridge, anchored by a 2-story farmhouse that had been vacant for 4 years, a timber frame barn that needed a new roof but had solid bones, and a long, low outbuilding that Ethan immediately recognized as a former horse stable. The land itself was flat near the road, and then rolled gently toward a creek bed in the northwest corner, and there was a line of old cottonwood trees along the property's western edge that turned gold in October and looked, in the listing photographs, like something from a painting. Gerald confirmed everything Ethan asked about. The parcel was completely independent. It predated the Silver Creek Estates development by more than 30 years. It was not subject to any homeowners association covenants, not covered by any deed restriction that would limit its agricultural use, and there were no active liens, no unresolved disputes, and no easements that would complicate a straightforward purchase. Ethan hired a title company to run a full search anyway, because that was the kind of man he was, and the title company confirmed everything Gerald had told him. He closed in late August. He drove out to Cedar Ridge the following Saturday with a truck full of tools and a border collie named Hatch, and he stood at the gate of the old farm at 7 in the morning with a cup of coffee from a gas station 40 miles back, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The first 3 weeks were hard in the best possible way. The farmhouse needed more than casual repairs. 3 windows on the south side had cracked during a winter freeze and been patched with plastic sheeting by whoever last lived there, and the kitchen floor had a soft spot near the sink that turned out to be a slow leak from a pipe that had been weeping silently for years. Ethan fixed the pipe himself, sistered the rotted subfloor joists, and patched the windows with proper glazing compound before the nights turned cold. He replaced the fence posts along the front pasture, all 37 of them, spending a full week driving steel posts into the dry ground and stretching new wire between them while Hatch ran circuits through the grass and spooked every grasshopper within a quarter mile. He found a satisfaction in that work that he had not found in much of anything in the 2 years since the divorce, something in the concrete relationship between effort and result, between a crooked post and a straight one, that felt honest in a way that very little else had felt recently. He cleaned out the stable, stripped years of accumulated hay and debris from the concrete floor, repaired the water lines, and began reaching out to a horse rescue operation in Pueblo that a neighbor had mentioned, a woman named Diane who kept goats on the adjoining property and who appeared one afternoon with a jar of pickled green beans and a long, comfortable conversation about the particular joys and frustrations of farming land in that part of Colorado. Diane was the first person Ethan had talked to at length since the move, and he realized, listening to her describe the 3 years it had taken to convince a county inspector to approve her goat shelter, that he had been lonelier than he admitted to himself, and that the loneliness was beginning to lift. The days had a shape again. He woke before sunrise and worked until his back reminded him he was no longer 30, then sat on the porch with Hatch and watched the light change over the eastern pasture while the rest of the world did whatever it did somewhere else. He had not thought much about what he left behind in Denver. He found, to his mild surprise, that he did not miss it in the way he had expected to miss it. What he missed, when he examined the feeling honestly, was not the life he had lived there, but the version of himself he had imagined becoming when he was younger, before the long middle years had accumulated their particular weight. Out here, working in the cold mornings with the mountains visible to the west on clear days, he had the strange and not unpleasant sense that he was becoming someone again. It was during one of those porch evenings, a Tuesday in late September, that he saw headlights turning off the county road and coming up his gravel drive. A white SUV, expensive, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who expected to be watched. Victoria Langford was a woman who understood the power of a first impression. She stepped out of the SUV wearing pressed slacks and a blazer despite the 48-degree temperature, carrying a leather portfolio that was too thick to contain anything accidental. She introduced herself by full name and title without pausing for the handshake to complete itself, the way people do when they have given the same introduction enough times that it has become a kind of performance. She told Ethan she was the president of Silver Creek Estates HOA, that she represented the interests of 47 families in the surrounding community, and that she was there to welcome him to the neighborhood and walk him through his obligations as a new property owner in the area. Ethan, who had been expecting a neighbor stopping by, stood with his coffee and listened. Victoria opened her portfolio and produced a multi-page document with the HOA's letterhead across the top and began explaining membership dues, landscape compliance requirements, the approval process for any structural modifications, and what she called the community aesthetic standards that all residents were expected to maintain. She used the word community 11 times in the first 4 minutes. Ethan let her finish before saying, calmly and without any particular edge, that there had been some kind of mistake, that his property was not part of Silver Creek Estates, and that he had both a clean title report and a recorded deed that would confirm that. Victoria smiled the way people smile when they believe someone is confused rather than correct. She tapped the portfolio and told him that the HOA's jurisdiction covered all properties within a certain radius of the original plat, that his parcel had been grandfathered into the covenant structure when Silver Creek Estates was established, and that the previous owner's failure to pay dues did not eliminate the obligation, it simply transferred it. She then extracted from the portfolio a single-page summary of what she claimed he owed, $8,240, representing 3 years of unpaid dues assessed against the property at the rate of $230 per month, plus a one-time administrative fee and 2 separate compliance violations she said had been documented during a drive-by inspection of the property before he purchased it. Ethan looked at the document for a long moment. Then he looked at Victoria. Then he told her, still without any edge in his voice, that he was going to need to see the governing documents that established the HOA's authority over his specific parcel, along with the recorded plat map showing the boundaries of the HOA's jurisdiction, and that until he reviewed those materials he would not be signing anything or making any payments. Victoria gathered her portfolio and told him he had 14 days to make his first payment, or the HOA would begin formal collection proceedings. She walked back to her SUV. Before she closed the door, she turned back and said, with the particular warmth of someone delivering a threat, "You'll learn how things work out here, Mr. Walker." Ethan watched her drive out. Then he went inside, opened his laptop, and began pulling up files. He started with the county assessor's website, pulling up his own parcel record, and then the parcel records for every property in Silver Creek Estates. The HOA's jurisdiction, according to its own founding documents, which were recorded with the county and therefore public, was defined by a specific legal description tied to a platted subdivision that had been filed in the late 1990s. Ethan's parcel predated that filing by decades. Its legal description referenced survey markers that placed it entirely outside the boundaries of the Silver Creek Estates plat. He compared the numbers twice, slowly, the way he had trained himself to do when a discrepancy in a client's title file felt like it might be more than a clerical error. He called Gerald the following morning and walked him through what he had found. Gerald confirmed it, adding that the title company had checked specifically for HOA covenants and found none that applied to the parcel. Ethan drafted a short, factual letter to Victoria Langford, referencing the specific recorded document numbers and legal descriptions, and explaining that his property was not subject to Silver Creek Estates HOA governance. He kept it brief. He did not use language that could be read as hostile, because he had spent enough time reading dispute correspondence to know that hostile letters invite hostile responses, and what he wanted was not a fight but a correction. He mailed it certified. He also sent a copy to the management company whose address appeared on the HOA's letterhead, because management companies have their own liability exposure and occasionally respond to facts more efficiently than principals do. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then the notices began arriving. The first was a final notice of assessment, demanding the same $8,240 and adding a late fee. The second was a notice of pending lien, informing him that a lien would be filed against his property within 30 days if payment was not received. The third was a letter from an attorney named Marcus Webb, informing him that the HOA had retained legal counsel and would be pursuing all available remedies under Colorado law. Ethan read each letter carefully, filed it in a folder he labeled Silver Creek HOA Active Dispute, and did not pay anything. He did, however, begin talking to his neighbors. Diane, from next door, told him she had been receiving similar letters for 2 years before finally paying a reduced settlement amount just to make the harassment stop. A retired schoolteacher named Paul Okafor, who lived a half-mile down the county road, said the HOA had once threatened to have his storage shed condemned because it was 2 feet taller than their guidelines allowed, even though the shed was on land that, like Ethan's, had no recorded covenant connecting it to Silver Creek Estates. What Ethan was beginning to understand, as he drove around Cedar Ridge and had careful conversations with people who had learned to be careful, was that Victoria Langford had been running this operation for a long time, and that it worked precisely because most people either believed the HOA had authority it didn't actually have, or found it less costly to pay than to fight. The system depended on that calculation remaining in Victoria's favor. Ethan intended to change it. The drone appeared on a Thursday morning in early October, hovering at about 40 feet over the southern fence line, moving slowly toward the stable with the patient, methodical progress of something conducting a survey. Ethan stepped out onto the porch with his coffee and watched it complete 2 slow passes over the property before it turned and headed back toward the Silver Creek Estates development. He photographed it with his phone, noting the time and direction of travel, and sent a text to Daniel Brooks, the attorney he had retained 2 weeks earlier after Marcus Webb's letter arrived. Daniel was a 41-year-old property attorney in Colorado Springs who had grown up in Cedar Ridge and who came recommended by Paul Okafor with the specific words, "He doesn't back down and he doesn't overcharge." Daniel had already reviewed the HOA's founding documents and Ethan's title file and had confirmed, firmly and without qualification, that the HOA's claims had no legal foundation. But he had also told Ethan that people without legal foundation could still cause serious problems if they were willing to spend enough money on it, and that Victoria Langford appeared to be exactly that kind of person. The drone was followed, 4 days later, by a physical visit from a man who introduced himself as the HOA's compliance officer, a heavyset, officious man named Gary, who arrived with a clipboard and a camera and stood at Ethan's front gate announcing that he was there to conduct a property inspection. Ethan came out, stood at the gate, and told Gary politely but precisely that he did not consent to any inspection of his property by any representative of Silver Creek Estates HOA, that the HOA had no legal authority over his parcel, and that if Gary stepped onto the property without permission he would be trespassing. Gary wrote something on his clipboard and drove away. The following week, a letter arrived from Marcus Webb documenting 3 new violations: that Ethan's front fence did not conform to HOA height standards, that his stable had been constructed without HOA approval, and that the grass in his east pasture exceeded the maximum allowable height as specified in the community guidelines. None of these were actual violations because none of the community guidelines applied to Ethan's property, but they were documented, time-stamped, and threatening. And Ethan understood that they were building a paper record, creating the appearance of a compliance dispute that could be used to pressure him, or potentially to confuse a judge who did not look closely at the underlying jurisdictional question. He forwarded the letter to Daniel and then went out to the pasture and kept working. The lien filing came on a Friday afternoon, recorded with the county clerk's office under Ethan's property address. Ethan found out about it Monday morning from Daniel, who had been monitoring the county record system the way a doctor monitors a patient's vitals during a complicated recovery, checking daily for new filings associated with Ethan's parcel. It was, Daniel explained carefully, a fraudulent lien because the HOA had no legal basis to encumber Ethan's title with any obligation it had never legally held. But removing it would require a legal proceeding, which meant time, money, filings, and responses, and the kind of formal cloud on a property title that could complicate any future sale or refinancing, because title searches surface liens and underwriters ask questions about liens, and not every buyer's attorney has the patience to read deeply enough into the history to understand that what looked like an obligation was actually a patient play, fiction maintained by intimidation. Victoria had escalated from nuisance to something more deliberate, and the lien was the proof of it. 2 days later, the formal eviction notice arrived, signed by Marcus Webb and citing the lien, the unpaid assessments, and what the document called ongoing willful non-compliance with community standards. Ethan read it sitting at his kitchen table with Daniel on speakerphone. Daniel told him that the eviction had no legal merit, that the HOA's authority to compel anything on his property was a fiction they had maintained through intimidation rather than law, and that what was needed now was not more letter writing but a formal legal challenge that forced the HOA to defend its claimed jurisdiction in front of a judge who would be required to look at the actual documents. He said something else, quietly, at the end of the call. He said he had been going back through the HOA's founding documents more carefully, looking at the recorded plat maps against the county's actual survey records, and that something was not adding up. He said the boundaries of Silver Creek Estates, as described in the HOA's own governing documents, did not quite match the boundaries shown in the county's surveyor records from the same period. He said it might be a drafting error. He said it might be something else. He said if Ethan had time that week, it might be worth driving to the county's seat and spending a few hours in the records room. Ethan spent 3 days in the county records room. He had worked in environments like it for most of his professional life, long fluorescent-lit rooms with rolling shelves of oversized map drawers and index binders organized by filing year and instrument number, and he moved through the Cedar Ridge County archives the way a person moves through their own house in the dark, by memory and feel rather than by sight. What he was looking for, specifically, were the original survey plats and deed records associated with the Silver Creek Estates development from the period when it was established, cross-referenced against the county's own survey benchmarks and section corner records. On the first day, he found what appeared to be a minor boundary discrepancy, the kind that could legitimately result from a surveyor working from an outdated base map or misreading a monument call in the original field notes. These things happen. They were the bread and butter of the title industry, a constant low background noise of minor errors that accumulated over decades of recording and had to be carefully untangled whenever a property was sold, refinanced, or disputed. By the second day, it was looking less minor. The discrepancy did not appear on one side of the plat. It appeared consistently on the eastern boundary, and only the eastern boundary, which was the boundary that abutted the older agricultural properties, the ones that predated the Silver Creek Estates development, and that the HOA had been assessing without authority for over a decade. A consistent error on one specific boundary is not the same as a random drafting mistake. By the third day, what he had assembled on the library table in front of him was a sequence of documents that told a specific and troubling story. The original plat for Silver Creek Estates, filed in 1998, included a boundary description on its eastern edge that referenced a survey monument that did not exist in the county's official monument records for that area. The description extended the HOA's claimed jurisdiction approximately 600 feet further east than the actual surveyed boundary of the platted subdivision. This 600-foot discrepancy encompassed, among other properties, the western portion of Ethan's farm, a strip of Paul Okafor's land, and a parcel belonging to a man named Frank Miller, whose family had owned it since the 1950s. More troubling still were the internal HOA records that had been filed with the county over the years: board meeting minutes, assessment schedules, modification approvals, and a collection of correspondence that had been appended to various recorded instruments. Buried in a batch of minutes from a board meeting in 2007 was a single paragraph, written in the careful language of people who understand that what they are writing will be read by someone they do not want to read it, that referenced a boundary clarification matter that had been reviewed by council and resolved in favor of the current plat description. There was no elaboration. There was no attachment referencing which council had reviewed it or what their analysis had concluded. There was no subsequent entry in any of the following year's minutes that mentioned the matter again. Whatever had been reviewed had apparently been resolved in a way that required no further discussion, which in Ethan's experience was rarely a sign of resolution and more commonly a sign of burial. He photographed every page, every map, every minute, methodically and without any particular hurry, because the county records room closed at 5 o'clock and he had learned long ago that the right way to work with documents is to get everything first and think about it later. He drove back to Cedar Ridge in the dark and called Daniel from his kitchen table and described what he had found, walking through each document in sequence, the way he had learned to present title findings to clients who needed to understand not just the conclusion but the chain of reasoning that led to it. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Victoria knows about this." He said it not as a question but as a statement of something that had just come into focus for him. He said, "She's been president for 15 years. She knows exactly where those boundaries are, and she knows that if anyone ever looked carefully enough, the whole thing falls apart." Frank Miller was 71 years old and had the kind of stillness that comes from spending a lifetime working land that doesn't cooperate with impatience. He met Ethan on his porch on a Wednesday afternoon and listened without interruption while Ethan explained what he had found. When Ethan finished, Frank was quiet for a while, looking out at his eastern pasture where a small herd of black Angus cattle grazed in the October light. Then he told Ethan that Silver Creek Estates HOA had been assessing his property since 2003, that he had paid because his daughter had told him fighting it would cost more than just paying, and that over the years he had paid somewhere in the range of $31,000 in dues and fees for a homeowners association he had never joined and never agreed to join. He said it with neither anger nor self-pity, the way a man describes something that happened to him a long time ago and that he has since decided to understand rather than resent. But when Ethan showed him the survey records, when Frank held the photocopies and traced the boundary lines with a finger that had worked this county for 50 years, something shifted in his expression. It was not anger exactly. It was the specific and settled expression of a man who has suspected a thing for a long time and has just been told that his suspicion was correct, and who feels not satisfaction at being right, but rather the quiet sorrow of understanding that the thing he suspected was worse than he had allowed himself to believe. He said, "So they knew." Ethan said yes. Frank was quiet again for a moment. He folded the photocopies carefully along their original creases and set them on the arm of his porch chair, and then he looked at Ethan directly for the first time since the conversation started. He said, "I want to talk to your lawyer." What followed was the kind of organizing that happens when people who have been handling something alone discover simultaneously that they are not alone. Daniel set up a meeting at a community center in Cedar Ridge that was attended by 14 property owners from the area surrounding Silver Creek Estates. Some had been paying HOA dues for years without ever asking where the authority came from. Some had received the same threatening letters Ethan had received and paid rather than fight. Some had complied with HOA improvement requirements in good faith, spending real money on landscaping changes and fence modifications and paint colors they were told were mandatory, never knowing that the organization issuing those requirements had no more legitimate authority over their property than a stranger on the street. A woman named Sandra Holt had sold a property 2 years earlier at a reduced price because a prospective buyer's lender had raised concerns about an HOA lien that Sandra had been told she was required to resolve before closing. Everyone in that room had a story. What they had not had, before Ethan found his way to the county records room, was documentation. A retired member of the HOA's own board of directors, a soft-spoken man named Robert Greer, who had served for 2 years before resigning over what he called procedural disagreements, agreed to speak to Daniel. What he said, in a signed affidavit that Daniel prepared the following week, was that during his time on the board he had been told explicitly by Victoria that the assessment of non-member properties was an established practice that had always been handled this way, and that when he asked to see the legal basis for it, he was told the documents were held by the HOA's attorney and not available for board review. The town hall meeting was held on a Thursday evening in November at the Cedar Ridge Community Center, a converted grain storage building with folding chairs and fluorescent lighting and a microphone stand that hummed with feedback if you stood too close. It was scheduled as an informational session on HOA governance, advertised with flyers that Victoria had distributed through Silver Creek Estates, and it drew more than 90 people, easily 3 times what the HOA had expected. Cars filled the small parking lot and lined both shoulders of the road outside, and people arrived in ones and twos with the slightly self-conscious air of people who have been told for a long time that attending something like this is not worth their time and have now decided, for their own reasons, that it is. Victoria arrived with Marcus Webb and 2 other board members and set up at a table at the front of the room, looking composed in the way that people look when they have spent years being the most powerful person in any room they enter and have no reason yet to expect that to change. Daniel presented first, using a projection of the county's official survey maps alongside the HOA's own recorded plat description, walking through the boundary discrepancy in precise, unhurried language that filled the room with a specific kind of attention, the attention of people who are learning, in real time, that something they accepted as true was not true. He showed the survey monument that did not exist. He showed the 600-foot extension of the claimed boundary. He showed the properties that fell within that extension. He showed the assessment records for those properties going back more than a decade. He showed the board minutes from 2007. When he finished, he introduced Ethan, who stood at the microphone and described what he had found in the county records room, speaking in the flat, careful cadence of someone presenting findings rather than making arguments. Then Frank Miller stood up, without being called, and described $31,000 over 20 years, and sat back down. The room was very quiet for a moment. Victoria tried to speak, beginning a response about pending legal matters and the importance of following proper procedures, and was interrupted by a woman near the back asking, in a voice that was not angry but was completely steady, how much money the HOA had collected from non-member properties over its entire history, and where that money had gone. Robert Greer, sitting near the middle of the room, raised his hand and said he had a statement he wanted to make, and began reading his affidavit aloud. And then Daniel stood again and introduced a final document, a report from a licensed Colorado surveyor who had been retained the previous week to conduct an independent survey of the relevant properties, who had found that the HOA's claimed boundary on its eastern edge was not supported by any verifiable monument, benchmark, or recorded survey, and appeared to have been drawn without a valid legal basis. What happened next did not happen all at once, and it did not happen quietly. Institutions don't collapse the way trees fall, in a single moment with a clean sound and a defined endpoint. They unravel, slowly and then suddenly, as one supporting element after another decides the cost of continuing is higher than the cost of stopping. They erode, piece by piece, as the people and systems that were holding them upright quietly remove themselves. The county assessor's office opened an inquiry into the HOA's recorded boundary documents within a week of the town hall meeting. The Colorado Division of Real Estate, which regulates HOA operations in the state, received a formal complaint signed by 11 property owners and began its own investigation. Daniel filed a motion to vacate the fraudulent lien on Ethan's property, supported by the surveyor's report and the county record's evidence, and the district court granted it within 3 weeks. Marcus Webb withdrew from representing the HOA shortly after that, citing what he described in a brief letter to the board as irreconcilable concerns about the basis of the association's claims. Victoria called a special board meeting to address what she termed misinformation being spread by disgruntled residents, and according to 2 people who attended, the meeting ended after 40 minutes, when 3 of the 5 remaining board members declined to vote on her proposed response and asked her to resign. She did not resign that night, but 2 of those board members did, and the HOA's remaining management company notified the board by letter that it was terminating its contract at the end of the month. The regulatory investigation, which expanded over the following weeks to include a review of the HOA's financial records, found what anyone who had been paying attention might have expected to find: years of assessments collected from properties with no documented basis for those assessments, reserve fund expenditures that were not properly authorized, and a pattern of documentation that a regulator's report later described as inadequate to demonstrate compliance with Colorado common interest community law. The money collected from Ethan and his neighbors, the people who had been paying dues to an association they never joined, had gone somewhere. Not all of it was accounted for by the expenses the HOA claimed to have incurred on their behalf. The state attorney general's office sent letters. Attorneys general tend not to send friendly ones. Victoria Langford appeared before the board one last time, in early December, at a meeting that had been reorganized under the oversight of a court-appointed administrator and was formally removed as president by a vote of the reconstituted board. She said nothing on her way out of the room. The people she passed in the parking lot said nothing to her either, which was perhaps worse. The district court issued its final ruling in the 3rd week of January, on a morning when the temperature outside Cedar Ridge dropped to 7 degrees, and the cottonwoods along the western edge of Ethan's property stood bare and silver against a pale sky. The ruling was 41 pages long and covered more ground than Ethan's case alone. It declared that his property had never been subject to Silver Creek Estates HOA jurisdiction, that all assessments and fees levied against his parcel were void and unenforceable, that the fraudulent lien had been vacated and the associated filing costs were to be borne by the HOA, and that the HOA was ordered to pay his legal fees and the costs of the independent survey. A separate section of the ruling addressed the HOA's broader conduct, finding that its practice of assessing non-member properties constituted an unfair and deceptive trade practice under Colorado law, and referring the matter to the state attorney general for further action on behalf of all affected property owners. It was not a short or provisional ruling. It was the kind of ruling that arrives when a court has examined something thoroughly and concluded that what it found was not a gray area. Ethan read it at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the quiet around him that had become, over the months since he arrived at Cedar Ridge, the thing he valued most about being here. He read it once straight through and then once again slowly, the way he had learned to read important documents, not for what they said the first time, but for what became clear on the second reading. Frank Miller's $31,000 and the smaller but no less real amounts paid by Sandra Holt and Paul Okafor and the others would take longer to recover, running through a separate proceeding that Daniel continued to manage, while Ethan turned his attention back to the things that had been waiting for him while all of this was unfolding. The stable needed 2 more stalls finished before the horses arrived. The barn roof, which he had patched in October, needed to be properly replaced before spring rains tested it. The creek bed in the northwest corner had been choked with invasive brush for years, and clearing it would take most of February if the weather cooperated. There was a garden plot on the south side of the house that the previous owner had apparently maintained with some seriousness, marked by the ghosts of raised bed borders and a rusted metal trellis against the south wall that suggested tomatoes and perhaps climbing beans, and Ethan had been thinking since August about what he wanted to grow there, about the particular pleasure of planting things that would not produce anything for months and would require patience and attention but would, in the end, reward both. He had also received a call from the Pueblo Horse Rescue about 2 mares, a chestnut and a gray, that were available for adoption and that the rescue coordinator described as bonded, meaning they did best together, which suited Ethan fine because he had always planned on more than one. He said he would drive down to meet them when things settled, and now things had settled, and he put the court ruling in the file and made a note on his calendar for the following Thursday. The barbecue happened on a Saturday in late February, on a day that surprised everyone with 52 degrees and full sun, and the particular quality of light that appears in Colorado in late winter, when the angle of the sun changes just enough to suggest that something warmer is possible, even if not yet certain. Frank brought brisket and a folding table. Diane brought coleslaw and the pickled green beans she had given Ethan on her first visit, and she brought 3 other neighbors whom Ethan had not yet met, including a quiet young couple who had moved to Cedar Ridge the previous spring and who had, within a month of arriving, received their own HOA welcome letter and paid out of an abundance of caution and the natural anxiety of being new somewhere, which was the same quiet mechanism that had kept this whole operation running for as long as it had. Sandra Holt came with a bottle of wine. Paul Okafor came with his grandson, who was 9 years old, and spent the first 20 minutes exploring the stable with the thorough, scientific attention of a child who has never been in a barn before and finds the entire universe of smells and textures and scale deeply interesting. Robert Greer came, still quiet, carrying a grocery bag with 2 six-packs of a local amber ale, and he settled into a folding chair near the fire with the relieved posture of a man who has done something difficult and right and is only now beginning to feel the weight of it lift. Daniel drove up from Colorado Springs with his wife and their 2 kids, who immediately discovered Hatch and spent the afternoon running the dog in circles through the pasture while the adults stood around the fire and ate and talked and did not talk about the HOA, mostly because there was not much left to say about it that hadn't already been settled, and because there were more interesting things to talk about. There was a conversation about the best time to plant garlic in Colorado's high plains. There was a conversation about the horse rescue in Pueblo and what the chestnut mare's personality was like. There was a long, wide-ranging exchange between Frank and Paul about the relative merits of different fence wire gauges that Ethan listened to carefully because he had a mile of fence line still to run before spring, and both men knew more about it than he did. Ethan had set up the folding tables near the new fence, the one he had built in October while the legal proceedings were still unresolved, the one Gary, the compliance officer, had documented as a violation in a letter that had since been filed in the trash rather than in the folder. The fence was good work, straight posts, taut wire, properly gated at both ends, built from materials he had picked himself and installed without any approval or compliance review from anyone. He had built it to last, and it would, and the fact that no one had been able to take it down or fine him for it or claim authority over it felt, on that warm February afternoon with the smell of brisket smoke in the air, like something quietly worth celebrating. At some point in the early afternoon, without planning it, Ethan found himself standing alone at the far end of the east pasture, 100 yards from the barbecue, looking back toward the farmhouse. Hatch had found him again and was sitting at his left heel in the alert, attentive posture the dog adopted when he sensed that Ethan was thinking rather than moving. The farmhouse looked different than it had in August, when he first drove out here and stood at the gate with a gas station coffee and felt, for reasons he could not then have named, that this was the right place. The windows were new. The porch boards had been replaced and painted a deep weathered gray that matched the color of old barnwood. The barn roof was next, but even as it was, the building had stopped looking abandoned and started looking kept, the particular look of a structure that someone was paying attention to, which is different in a way that is immediately visible once you know what you are looking at. The pasture fence ran clean and straight to the horizon. The cottonwoods were bare but would leaf out in April, the way they had leafed out every April for 100 years, indifferent to whoever was standing in the grass looking at them. The creek in the northwest corner was clearer now, the brush cut back, the water moving in the cold afternoon air with a sound that carried all the way across the field. Somewhere in the months between Victoria Langford's first visit and the court's final ruling, without quite deciding to, Ethan had stopped waiting to feel settled and had simply become settled. He was not sure exactly when it had happened, which moment or week or accumulation of ordinary mornings had done it, but he noticed the absence of the waiting the way you notice a sound has stopped, not during the silence but sometime after it, when you realize you haven't been listening for it anymore. Maybe it was during one of the long evenings in the county records room, when the work of looking carefully at documents had felt less like legal strategy and more like the thing itself, the simple act of paying attention to where things actually were rather than where someone else claimed them to be, which was also, he understood now, a description of what he had spent the years since his marriage trying to figure out how to do with his own life. Maybe it was earlier, one of those mornings in the first week when he was out replacing fence posts and the sun came up over the eastern flat, and there was nothing in his field of vision that someone else had designed for him, approved for him, or required him to maintain to their specifications. Maybe it was the day Frank Miller had said quietly over a map of his own land. So they knew, and Ethan had understood that he was not dealing with an error but with a choice, and that choices have consequences, and that he was in a position to help ensure those consequences arrived at the people who had made them, which is a rare enough position that it felt, when he recognized it, like something he was obligated to use. He had not gone looking for a fight when he came to Cedar Ridge. He had gone looking for exactly the opposite, but he had learned, in the months since the white SUV came up his driveway, that the two things are not always as separate as they seem, and that sometimes the only path to the peace you came for runs directly through the thing that is standing in front of it, and that there is no way around that takes you somewhere you actually want to be. He picked up a stick from the grass and threw it toward the creek bed. Hatch was gone before the stick had time to land. Ethan put his hands in the pockets of his jacket and turned back toward the farmhouse and the fire and the sound of people he had not known a year ago, standing on land that was, without any qualification or asterisk or pending legal matter, entirely his. The chestnut mare was arriving from Pueblo the following Thursday. He had already built the first stall. The second one could wait until the weekend. He had time. That was the thing about this place, the thing he had known from the first morning at the gate, with the gas station coffee and the pale October sky above the plains and the cottonwood line catching the first light along the western edge. He had time. And the land, quiet and indifferent and enormously patient, would still be here when he got to it. There are things worth fighting for, not because winning is guaranteed, but because the alternative is learning to pretend that someone else's claim on your life is legitimate, and that pretending, done long enough, changes who you are in ways that are difficult to trace and very hard to undo. Ethan Walker had spent 22 years reading the fine print of other people's property records, and what he knew, better than most, was that a line on a map is only as real as the document that created it, and that documents can be wrong, and that wrong things, when you have the patience and the specific knowledge to trace them back to their source, can be corrected. He had traced this one all the way back. He had corrected it. The fence was straight. The gate was latched. And for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember, the land on the other side of it was entirely, finally, and without question his own.